cursed medieval ages, the most terrifying, mysterious artifacts in history. The medieval world was not just an age of kings, crusades, and castles. It was also an age of fear. Deep, irrational, and spiritual fear. People believed the world was filled with unseen forces. Every object could be blessed or cursed. Every relic could heal or destroy. And every artifact carried a story that blurred the line between faith and horror. Across Europe, from the cold monasteries of Britain to the war-torn lands of Eastern kingdoms, countless objects were said to hold unnatural power. Some were buried, some were locked away, some disappeared without explanation, and some, according to legend, still exist, waiting. This is the forgotten world of cursed medieval artifacts, a world where metal, wood, bone, and stone were believed to store the anger of saints, the punishment of demons, and the memories of unspeakable crimes. The fear behind medieval relics. In the Middle Ages, religion and superstition were not separate ideas. They were the same force in different forms. A relic of a saint could heal a dying man. A cursed sword could doom an entire bloodline. A mirror could trap a soul. A ring could carry a plague of misfortune for generations. Monks recorded miracles, but also warnings. Soldiers whispered about weapons that refused to return to their scabbards. Kings feared crowns that brought madness. Entire villages avoided objects that were believed to carry death inside them. Whether these stories were real or not did not matter. What mattered was belief, and belief gave power to objects. The Black Mirror of St. Aldwyn. One of the earliest recorded cursed objects in medieval Europe was known as the Black Mirror of St. Aldwyn. According to monastic chronicles, the mirror was not made of ordinary glass, but of a dark, polished stone, smoother than water and colder than iron. It was kept inside a monastery in northern England during the early 1100s. The monks used it for reflection during prayer. But over time, strange reports began to appear. Those who looked into it for too long claimed they did not see their own reflection. Instead, they saw themselves older, corrupted, sometimes even dead. Some saw their future deaths in disturbing detail. Others claimed the mirror showed them committing sins they had never done, but later confessed to doing. The abbot ordered it sealed, but the legend says the mirror refused to stay covered. Cloths placed over it were found folded neatly beside it. Wooden crates split open without damage. Eventually it was removed from the monastery and never recorded again. Some believe it was destroyed. Others believe it still exists, hidden in a private collection, still showing people what they are not meant to see. The sword that drank oaths. Throughout medieval Europe, swords were more than weapons. They were symbols of truth. Knights swore vows upon them. Kings used them to seal alliances. But one sword, mentioned in fragmented French records, was feared even by its owner. It was known as the Oath Eater. This blade was said to have been forged during the early Crusades by a blacksmith who had broken his religious vows. As punishment, according to legend, he forged a sword using iron melted from broken church bells and water taken from a graveyard well. The sword had one terrifying trait. Anyone who swore an oath while holding it could not break that promise without suffering consequences. Knights who pledged loyalty and later betrayed it reportedly fell ill within days. Their bodies weakened, their minds fractured. Some died speaking only in broken confessions. Even worse, The sword allegedly collected broken promises. Witnesses claimed it became heavier after each betrayal, as if absorbing guilt itself. Eventually, it disappeared during a siege. Some say the last knight who carried it refused to draw it again, fearing what it had become. The saint's hand, that never decayed religious relics, were extremely common in medieval Europe. But among them, one stands out in fearsome contradiction: the hand of Saint Verenius. Unlike typical relics, this hand was not preserved in gold or glass. It was preserved naturally, without decay, without wax, without salt. It remained perfectly intact for centuries after the saint's death. But the problem was not preservation. It was movement. Chroniclers from a monastery in southern France recorded that the hand occasionally changed position inside its reliquary. Fingers that were once folded in prayer were later seen slightly open. At times it appeared to be pointing towards specific individuals. Several monks reported faint warmth radiating from it during night prayers. Others swore they heard faint tapping sounds inside the reliquary when the monastery bell rang. The church eventually declared the reports unverified spiritual interpretations, but the relic was quietly relocated. After that, no further records exist. The plague ring of Verona. One of the most feared cursed objects in medieval folklore is the plague ring of Verona. It first appeared during the 14th century, a time when Europe was already drowning in the Black Death. According to legend, the ring was owned by a nobleman who believed he could carry death as protection. The ring was made of iron, engraved with symbols that no historian has been able to fully translate. It was said to have been taken from a mass grave and forged again by a traveling alchemist. Every household that came into contact with the ring reportedly fell ill within weeks. Not just the owner, but servants, guests, even animals. What made the legend more disturbing was its pattern. The plague always appeared in cycles around the ring's movement. Wherever it went, death followed in predictable waves. Eventually, the nobleman vanished. The ring was last seen being buried inside a sealed stone chamber beneath a collapsed chapel. But locals claimed that even after the burial, sickness still returned to the surrounding region every few decades. Why these objects became cursed? Medieval society had no scientific explanation for disease, mental illness, or natural disaster, so meaning had to be created. When tragedy struck after contact with an object, the object itself became the explanation. A sword did not just kill, it carried betrayal. A mirror did not just reflect, it revealed truth too painful for the mind. A ring did not just exist, it carried the weight of unseen punishment. Over time, these stories evolved. Fear strengthened them, repetition preserved them, and silence made them more powerful. The pattern of disappearance. One of the most disturbing patterns across medieval cursed artifact legends is disappearance. Almost every object shares the same fate. It is recorded clearly once. It causes fear or tragedy. It is hidden, sealed, or lost. Then it vanishes from history entirely. No one ever documents its destruction. No one confirms it was safe. It simply stops appearing in records. And that silence is what makes these artifacts more terrifying than their stories. The medieval world did not only fear war, famine, and plague. It feared objects that seemed to carry intention, things that appeared to remember, to respond, to punish. And among the most chilling legends were those tied not just to common relics, but to royal power, sacred orders, and forbidden knowledge. As we move deeper into the cursed artifacts of the Middle Ages, the stories become darker, more political, and far more difficult to dismiss as simple superstition. Because these were not only objects feared by villagers, they were objects feared by kings, knights, and entire religious orders. The Blood Crown of Bohemia. Among royal legends of Central Europe, none is more feared than the Blood Crown of Bohemia. It is said to have been worn by a ruler who believed divine authority could be strengthened through conquest. The crown itself was described not as gold alone, but as a strange alloy of gold and dark iron, as if it had been reforged after destruction. What made the crown infamous was not its appearance, but what happened to those who claimed it. Every ruler associated with it was said to suffer the same fate: paranoia, betrayal, and violent downfall. Kings who wore it began to see enemies where none existed. Trusted advisors were executed. Alliances collapsed overnight. One chronicle describes a king who refused to remove the crown even in sleep, claiming it whispered warnings only he could hear. Within months, his own court turned against him. Whether this was political instability or something more sinister, the legend insists the crown did not simply symbolize power, it consumed it. Eventually, during a civil uprising, the crown vanished from the royal treasury. No record confirms whether it was destroyed or hidden. But after that moment, the royal line weakened rapidly, as if something had been removed that once anchored authority itself. The cursed chalice of the Knights Templar. Few names carry as much mystery in medieval history as the Knights Templar. They were warriors, monks, and guardians of sacred roots during the Crusades. But in later legends, they are also linked to forbidden relics that the Church never publicly acknowledged. One such object is the cursed chalice. According to fragmented accounts, this chalice was discovered during a campaign in the Holy Land. It was not made of precious metal, but of a dark, heavy stone-like material that seemed resistant to heat and damage. Templar knights who drank from it during ritual ceremonies reportedly experienced visions, terrifying, vivid hallucinations of future battles, betrayals, and the collapse of their own order. Some knights became obsessed, refusing to separate from the chalice. Others attempted to destroy it, but claimed it could not be broken. Even fire did not leave marks on its surface. As suspicion grew within religious authorities, the chalice was ordered to be transported in secrecy. During its journey, the escorting group disappeared entirely. Horses were found wandering. Supplies remained untouched, but no knights were ever recovered. From that point onward, records of the chalice end abruptly. Some believe the Knights Templar hid it deliberately. Others claim it was sealed beneath a monastery. And darker theories suggest it was never an object of stone at all, but something that only appeared solid to those who touched it. The manuscripts that should not be read. In several monasteries across medieval Europe, monks recorded not only holy scripture, but also forbidden writings, texts considered too dangerous for public knowledge. Among these, one category stands out: manuscripts said to react to reading. Known in later folklore as the demon-etched manuscripts, these books were written in languages that shifted slightly each time they were copied. Letters appeared to rearrange themselves when no one was looking directly at the page. One surviving account describes a monk who attempted to translate such a manuscript. At first, the text appeared to describe theological concepts, but as he continued, the content began to mirror his own thoughts. as if the book was anticipating his interpretation. After several days, he reportedly refused to continue reading. When asked why, he said, "It finishes my sentences before I think them." The manuscript was later sealed in iron chains within a restricted library chamber. Years later, when the chamber was reopened, the manuscript was found lying open despite no one having entered. The chains remained locked. The pages were blank. No ink, no writing, as if the content had been removed or absorbed. The whispering stone of execution squares. Execution grounds in the Middle Ages were places of public warning. But in certain towns, a different kind of fear emerged. Fear not of the execution itself, but of the stone upon which it took place. Known in oral tradition as the whispering stone, this artifact was described as a flat slab placed beneath execution sites in parts of northern France. Witnesses claim that during executions, the stone produced faint sounds, like murmurs beneath the surface. At first, officials dismissed it as wind or crowd noise, but reports became more specific. Some executioners claimed they heard names being spoken from beneath the stone immediately after death. Others reported that condemned individuals sometimes reacted violently upon stepping onto it, as if they had heard something terrifying before the execution even began. One account describes a prisoner refusing to approach the platform, claiming the stone had already told him how he would die. After repeated rumors, authorities eventually removed the stone and replaced it. The original slab was buried outside the city walls. Strangely, executions in that town reportedly became less frequent after its removal. Whether this was coincidence or consequence remains unknown. The iron reliquary that refused to open. Relics were usually kept in ornate containers, often made of gold or silver. But one object defied every attempt at classification: the iron reliquary of Saint Maurian. This was a sealed container, forged entirely from blackened iron, without visible seams or openings. It was said to contain a holy relic of unknown origin, possibly bone, cloth, or something else entirely. The disturbing element was not what was inside, but what happened when people attempted to open it. Every recorded attempt resulted in mechanical failure. Tools broke, keys bent. Fire had no effect. Even skilled blacksmiths claimed the metal resisted being shaped, as if it refused intention. Monks reported that when placed in silence, the reliquary sometimes emitted faint, rhythmic sounds, almost like breathing or distant knocking. One abbot described it as not a container waiting to be opened, but a thing deciding not to open. Eventually, it was sealed within a stone vault and never touched again. Why power and fear became the same thing? In the medieval imagination, power was never neutral. It was always moral, spiritual, or cursed. A crown could corrupt a king. A chalice could reveal the future. A manuscript could think back at its reader. Objects were not passive. They were participants. And because explanation was limited, anything that defied understanding became supernatural by default. This is why cursed artifacts often appear in royal courts, religious orders, and moments of political collapse. They were used to explain instability that no one could otherwise control. Across medieval Europe, fear did not remain confined to superstition alone. It became structured into belief systems, recorded in monasteries, whispered in courts, and passed down as warnings from generation to generation. By the time these stories reached their later forms, cursed artifacts were no longer seen as rare anomalies. They were considered part of the hidden architecture of the world. In this continuation, the artifacts become even more disturbing because they begin to blur the boundary between object and agency. These are not merely things that bring misfortune. These are things that appear to make choices. The crown that chooses its victim. In the fragmented legends of Eastern European courts, there is mention of a crown that did not simply pass from ruler to ruler, but seemed to select who would wear it next. Known as the crown of silent judgment, it was said to be forged during a period of civil war, when legitimacy itself was uncertain. Unlike other royal crowns, this one was not designed to symbolize divine right. Instead, it was described as being forged in secrecy, using metal taken from broken regalia of fallen kings. What made it feared was not its power over those who wore it, but its behavior before being worn. Witnesses claim that in the royal treasury, the crown would sometimes shift position between visits. Guards insisted it was always placed on the same pedestal, yet it would be found slightly closer to the entrance door, as if anticipating its next bearer. More unsettling were the succession events. In multiple cases, rulers who were not directly in line for the throne suddenly rose to power after the crown was retrieved. Others in the rightful lineage fell into illness or political ruin. Chroniclers avoided direct explanation, but one marginal note in a monastery record states, "It does not choose the strongest, it chooses the next." After the fall of the associated dynasty, the crown disappears from history entirely, with no confirmation of destruction or preservation. The bell that rings without wind. In a remote monastery in the Alpine regions, there is a legend of a bell that could ring without being touched. The Bell of Lamentation, as it was later called, hung in a detached tower far above the monastery grounds. It was used only during funerals and moments of severe crisis. But over time, monks began to notice something deeply disturbing. The bell would ring on nights when no wind moved, no rope was pulled, and no human presence was near the tower. At first, it was dismissed as structural vibration or echo, but patterns emerged. The bell rang most frequently before deaths within the monastery. Sometimes it rang for individuals who had shown no signs of illness. One chronicler wrote that on one occasion, the bell rang 3 times in the night. The following morning, 3 monks were found dead in their chambers, without visible cause. Fear spread quickly. Eventually, no monk would climb the tower alone. The bell was declared divinely untrusted and silenced. But silence did not stop the fear. Years later, travelers passing the abandoned monastery claimed to hear faint ringing during storms, despite no bell being present. The armor that could not be removed after battle. Among knightly orders of the Crusade, armor was not just protection, it was identity. But one suit of armor, mentioned in several inconsistent records, became infamous for a far darker reason. Known as the armor of unfinished war, it was reportedly worn by a knight who survived battles that should have killed him. Arrow strikes, sword wounds, even fire exposure failed to bring him down. However, after the final recorded battle, the knight reportedly attempted to remove his armor and could not. At first, it was believed the locking mechanisms had been damaged, but blacksmiths who examined it later claimed there were no conventional locks at all. The armor had bonded to the wearer. Over time, the knight's behavior changed. He no longer removed his helmet, even during feasts. He stopped speaking clearly, communicating only in brief, fractured phrases. Eventually, he stopped responding altogether. The armor was never removed. Even in death, Some accounts claim that when the body was finally placed in a tomb, faint metallic movement could still be heard inside the coffin long after burial. The severed relic that never decayed. In medieval relic traditions, parts of saints were preserved as holy objects. Bones, cloth fragments, even preserved organs. But one relic stood apart in disturbing contradiction. The severed relic of St. Idran was said to be a hand detached during martyrdom, preserved in a sealed crystal container. Unlike normal relics, this hand showed no signs of decay over centuries. But what disturbed monks most was not preservation, it was change. Descriptions vary, but some records claim the hand occasionally appeared slightly repositioned, as if adjusting its grip. Others describe faint warmth or moisture appearing inside the sealed container, despite no exposure to external conditions. One visiting bishop reportedly ordered the container opened for inspection. When opened, the hand was found facing upward, though it had been previously documented facing downward. After this event, the relic was declared too unstable for public veneration and was permanently sealed away. No further records exist. The manuscripts that were burned, while still alive. Monastic archives were carefully preserved, but some texts were considered too dangerous even for storage. Among these were manuscripts that did not behave like static writings. Known collectively as the living codices, these texts were said to alter their content over time without human interference. Scribes reported that copied versions never matched the original exactly. Sentences changed meaning. Names shifted. Entire passages disappeared when reread. One monastery in southern Europe recorded a disturbing event. A manuscript that appeared to rewrite itself during a copying session. Two monks working on transcription found that their copies no longer matched each other, or the original, even though they worked side by side. Fear escalated when marginal notes began appearing that referenced the monks themselves, details that should not have been known by any text. Eventually, the entire archive containing these manuscripts was burned under ecclesiastical order. However, witnesses claimed that even in fire, certain pages did not burn immediately, instead curling inward as if resisting destruction. After the fire, survivors reported hearing faint scratching sounds from the ashes for several days. Why these objects seem to act, across all these legends, a pattern emerges. The artifacts are not simply dangerous, they appear responsive. They move, react, anticipate, or persist in ways that defy ordinary explanation. In medieval thinking, this was interpreted through theology, divine punishment, demonic influence, or spiritual residue. But beneath the interpretation lies something more human. Fear transforms uncertainty into intention. When an object is associated with tragedy, every coincidence becomes evidence. Every anomaly becomes behavior. And over time, repetition turns rumor into structure. By the later medieval period, fear surrounding cursed artifacts had reached a point where it no longer needed proof. It sustained itself through repetition, testimony, and the silence of institutions that refused to confirm or deny anything too dangerous to explain. In this part, the artifacts become even more psychologically disturbing, not because they are louder or more violent, but because they begin to affect identity, memory, and the boundaries of the self. These are the objects that do not just bring misfortune, they replace, reflect, or rewrite those who come near them. The mask that replaced its wearer. In Venetian and Eastern European folklore, there is mention of a ceremonial mask known only as the Veil of Hollow Identity. Unlike ordinary masks used for ritual or disguise, this one was described as unusually heavy and perfectly smooth, with no visible eye holes from certain angles. It was said to be made from an unknown pale material, neither wood nor metal, but something that felt too warm to be dead matter. According to fragmented accounts, the mask was used during political ceremonies where anonymity was required. But over time, something deeply unsettling was noticed. Individuals who wore the mask for extended periods began to behave differently after removing it. At first, the changes were subtle: tone of voice, posture, hesitation. Then more pronounced shifts occurred. Some began using unfamiliar phrases. Others stopped responding to their previous names. One account describes a nobleman who wore the mask during a diplomatic gathering. After the event, he insisted he had never attended it, despite dozens of witnesses. Eventually, the mask was sealed away after a rumor spread that it did not merely conceal identity, but gradually overwrote it. The final recorded note about it states, "The mask leaves nothing behind when it is removed. Only the idea of a person remains." The knife that never stopped dripping blood. Among battlefield relics, few are as feared as the blade of endless wound. It is described as a short ceremonial knife, possibly used in oath rituals or executions. Its metal was said to be darkened not by rust, but by age and repeated contact with something that never fully washed away. What made it infamous was a persistent claim. The blade always appeared wet. Even when cleaned, even when stored, even when sealed in cloth, witnesses insisted that a faint red residue would return overnight. Not enough to be practical, but enough to be unmistakable. Soldiers who encountered it during campaigns reported extreme discomfort, describing a sensation of pressure in the air around the blade, as if the object carried the memory of violence. Some legends claim the knife was used in a series of executions where no blood was ever seen on the ground, yet the blade remained unchanged in its damp appearance. Eventually, it was locked in a monastery vault after multiple caretakers refused to handle it. The last recorded entry by a monk reads, "It does not clean because it does not finish." The book that spoke back during confession. In medieval religious practice, confession was sacred, structured, and deeply private. But one artifact allegedly disrupted even that sacred boundary. Known as the Confessor's Codex, it is described as a thick, leather-bound book kept in a remote monastery used for recording penitence and moral instruction. At first, it functioned normally. Monks would write confessions or spiritual reflections. But over time, strange phenomena were reported. Entries in the book began to change after being written. Words would shift slightly in tone, sometimes softening, sometimes becoming accusatory. Some monks reported that their written confessions no longer matched what they remembered writing. The most disturbing accounts describe moments where monks reading the codex alone believed they heard responses, not voices in the air, but thoughts that felt externally placed. One senior cleric wrote that while reading his own entry, a sentence appeared that he had not written. "You have not told the whole truth." The book was immediately declared forbidden. It was sealed in chains and placed in isolation. Years later, when authorities reopened the vault, the book was found open to a blank page. Yet ink stains remained on the parchment, as if something had been erased, but not removed. The burial shroud that held no body, but still moved. Burial shrouds were common in medieval funerary rites, but one particular shroud became the subject of unsettling legend. Known as the Shroud of the Absent Dead, it was reportedly used during a burial ceremony where the body of a noblewoman was never recovered after death. The shroud was still placed in the grave as symbolic closure. But after the burial, guards claimed something impossible occurred. The soil above the grave occasionally shifted in unnatural patterns, as if something beneath was adjusting its position. On certain nights, faint impressions appeared on the surface, folds in the earth resembling fabric being moved from below. When the grave was later opened for inspection, the shroud was found intact, but strangely arranged in a way that suggested it had been folded recently. There was no body inside. Despite this, reports of disturbances continued near the burial site for years. Locals avoided the area entirely, claiming it felt occupied. The final sealed vaults of cursed medieval Europe. By the end of the medieval period, the response to cursed artifacts became systematic. Instead of destruction, many objects were simply sealed away, buried, walled in, or hidden in forgotten chambers beneath monasteries and castles. These sealed locations became known in some traditions as silent vaults. Their exact contents were never fully recorded. Only partial inventories exist, often redacted or intentionally vague. Descriptions include phrases like object that resists classification, relic with unstable sanctity, item requiring perpetual silence, container not to be opened under any condition. What makes these vaults particularly unsettling is not what is known, but what is absent. No final records of disposal, no confirmation of destruction, only cessation of documentation. In medieval administrative logic, if something was destroyed, it was recorded. If it was missing, it was noted. But in these cases, the records simply stop, as if the subject itself was removed from official memory. Why the fear intensified over time? As these legends accumulated, medieval society developed a pattern of escalating caution. The more unexplained an artifact became, the less it was investigated. Objects were no longer examined to understand them. They were contained to prevent interaction, and containment, over time, became indistinguishable from acknowledgement. Because to seal something away is still to admit it exists. By the final stretch of medieval legend, cursed artifacts are no longer treated as isolated relics or superstition-driven stories. They become something closer to a hidden system of forbidden knowledge, an entire category of objects that history itself seems to avoid describing in full. In this last part, the tone of the story shifts again. The artifacts are no longer just dangerous, reactive, or identity-altering. They become reality-breaking in the medieval imagination. Objects that distort time, erase memory, and resist even destruction. And perhaps most unsettling of all, some of them are said to remain unaccounted for, simply because no record of them survives at all. The crown that was never meant to exist. Among all royal legends, one stands apart not for its power, but for its absence in official history. Known only in fragmented oral traditions as the unwritten crown, it is described as a royal artifact that appears in stories, but never in inventories, treasury records, or coronation documentation. Some accounts claim it was used in a brief and unstable succession crisis, where multiple rulers were crowned in rapid sequence, each one lasting only days or weeks. Others suggest it was never physical at all, but something that manifested legitimacy temporarily before dissolving. What makes the legend disturbing is the consistency of one claim. Everyone who describes it remembers it differently. In some versions, it is iron. In others, gold. In others still, it has no material form at all. Only pressure, like an idea made heavy. Chroniclers who attempted to reconcile accounts often left marginal notes such as, "Subject cannot be stabilized in record." Eventually, references to the crown disappear entirely from official archives, as if later administrations ensured it was never documented again. The cathedral bell that stopped time during ringing deep within Gothic architectural legend exists one of the most extraordinary claims of the medieval world. A bell that did not merely ring, but altered time itself. The bell of absolute silence, allegedly installed in a grand cathedral during its early construction, was said to be larger than any known bell of its era. Its metal composition was unknown, described only as too dark to reflect candlelight properly. According to legend, when it was first rung during a ceremonial mass, all activity in the cathedral stopped, not paused in motion. Stopped in perception. Witnesses claimed that movement froze mid-action. Falling dust remained suspended. Candle flames held shape, and even breath appeared to cease mid-air. Yet consciousness remained intact. Those present reported complete awareness during this interval, though no passage of time could be measured. When sound finally ceased, everything resumed instantly, as if no interruption had occurred. After this single event, the bell was permanently deactivated and sealed within the cathedral tower. No further attempts to ring it were recorded. Later generations referred to it only as the sound that should not be repeated, the mirror that showed other lives. You did not live. Mirror lore in medieval Europe is extensive, but one artifact stands far beyond ordinary superstition. Known in later traditions as the Mirror of Divergent Lives, it was said to be a tall, arched surface of polished obsidian-like material kept in a noble household library. Unlike ordinary mirrors, it did not simply reflect the viewer's current appearance. It reflected alternatives. Those who stood before it reported seeing themselves in entirely different lives. Lives they had never lived, but could somehow recognize emotionally. A monk saw himself as a soldier. A merchant saw himself as a beggar. A noblewoman saw herself as a traveler across unknown lands. More disturbing accounts claim that prolonged viewing caused individuals to lose certainty about their actual identity. Some began referring to themselves in past tense. Others questioned which version of their life was real. One recorded testimony describes a man who left the mirror and insisted he had returned from the wrong life. After this incident, the mirror was removed from public access and stored in an undisclosed private collection. Its current whereabouts are unknown. The book that could not be destroyed in any language. Among all cursed medieval manuscripts, one stands as the ultimate contradiction to destruction itself. Referred to in fragmented records as the indestructible codex, it was a book that resisted every known method of removal, alteration, or annihilation. Attempts to burn it resulted in ash forming around it, but never consuming it. Attempts to bury it led to its reappearance in storage chambers. Even efforts to tear its pages reportedly resulted in the pages reforming after separation. What made it even more disturbing was not just its survival, but its mutability. The language inside it appeared to change depending on who read it. Scholars reported that it would render itself in whatever script the reader understood best. yet never in a stable translation. One monk wrote, "It does not contain text. It contains comprehension." Eventually, the book was sealed within a multi-layered containment vault beneath a monastery, surrounded by silence protocols. Orders forbidding reading, speaking, or even looking at it. After several generations, the vault itself was abandoned, and records of its exact location were lost. The disappearance of cursed history itself. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of medieval cursed artifact lore is not any single object, but the pattern of disappearance that surrounds all of them. Across chronicles, inventories, and monastic records, there is a repeated phenomenon. Artifacts are described clearly once. They are feared. They are contained or hidden. And then documentation stops. No destruction record, no final transfer record, no confirmation of loss, only silence. Historians attempting to trace these objects often encounter missing pages, redacted sections, or entire gaps in archival continuity. Some scholars argue this is due to war, fire, or administrative decay. Others suggest something more deliberate, that certain knowledge was intentionally removed from historical continuity because it was too destabilizing to preserve. In medieval thinking, forgetting something did not mean it was gone. It meant it was contained in a different way. Final reflection. The cursed artifacts of the medieval world, whether real or imagined, reveal something deeper than superstition. They reveal how human beings respond to the unknown. When understanding fails, meaning is created. When meaning is created, objects become symbols. And when symbols are feared long enough, they become legends that feel indistinguishable from reality. These artifacts may never have existed as described, but the fear they represent absolutely did. And in the medieval world, fear was one of the most powerful forces of all. Even after the supposed end of the medieval era, whispers did not stop. They simply changed form. When kingdoms modernized and monasteries were dissolved, many assumed that cursed artifacts would finally be catalogued, studied, or destroyed. Instead, something else happened. They disappeared again. But not completely. Because in later centuries, scattered references began to appear in private letters, burned catalogue fragments, and corrupted archival records, suggesting that entire collections of medieval cursed objects were never truly lost. They were relocated. The vault beneath the vanished monastery. In several European regions, there are recurring stories of underground chambers beneath monasteries that were sealed not by collapse, but by deliberate design. These chambers are described as being constructed with no entrance from the outside, only exits that were later bricked shut. Inside these spaces, inventories allegedly listed objects that were not meant to be named in public records. Items described only as unclassified relic requiring silence, object of recurring instability, item removed from liturgical handling, artifact not to be assigned meaning, no descriptions of form, no measurements, no drawings, only caution, and always the same final instruction in marginal notes. Do not reopen under any circumstance. The traveling collection that was never fully recorded. One of the most persistent later legends speaks of a mobile collection of cursed medieval artifacts that survived long after the Middle Ages ended. It is said to have been transported in sealed iron-bound chests by unnamed custodians, sometimes monks, sometimes state officials, sometimes individuals with no recorded affiliation at all. The strange part of these accounts is inconsistency in size. Some records describe a single chest. Others describe an entire convoy. Others claim the collection changed size depending on who observed it. Each attempt to document it fails in the same way. Partial records, missing pages, or contradictory inventories written by the same hand. One surviving fragment simply states, "It cannot be counted because it does not remain still in memory." The modern excavation that found nothing. In the 19th century, during early archaeological interest in medieval religious sites, a team reportedly excavated a sealed chamber beneath a collapsed European chapel. According to early reports, the chamber contained shelving, containment niches, and iron anchors used to restrain containers. But when official documentation was compiled, something strange occurred. The final published report omitted the inventory section entirely. Personal diaries from members of the excavation team later surfaced, but they contradict each other. Some claim they found empty rooms. Others describe objects that could not be safely described in language. One line repeats across multiple versions of the diary. "We agreed not to describe what we saw." The theory of self-erasing artifacts. Modern interpretations of these legends propose a disturbing idea that the reason cursed medieval artifacts disappear from records is not only human fear or censorship, but instability of documentation itself. If an object causes fear, distortion, or uncertainty, then even describing it becomes unreliable. Names change, descriptions shift, records conflict. Over time, consistency collapses. And what remains is not absence, but unspeakability. Final closing reflection. Whether these cursed artifacts were real objects, symbolic inventions, or psychological reflections of medieval fear, they serve one consistent function. They expose the boundary between knowledge and uncertainty. The Middle Ages were not only an age of kings and wars, they were an age where meaning itself was unstable. The people tried to explain suffering, chance, and chaos through objects that carried intention. Cursed artifacts were never just about superstition. They were about the human need to give form to fear. And once fear takes form, it becomes very difficult to erase. By the time medieval Europe faded into early modern history, something strange happened to cursed artifact legends. They didn't end. They fragmented. Each region kept a different version. Each archive preserved partial truth. And each generation inherited a slightly altered fear. But beneath all variations, a deeper pattern began to emerge in later interpretations. Some artifacts were not lost. They were unstable in record, meaning that every attempt to document them changed what they were. The theory of unrecordable objects. NAS. Scholars who studied medieval anomalies in later centuries began to notice something unusual in surviving manuscripts. Certain artifacts only appear in footnotes, never in main text. Others appear in inventories but are immediately crossed out, replaced, or annotated with phrases like "correction required," "description unreliable," "entry invalidated after revision." Object cannot be consistently defined. This led to a controversial idea that some objects resist being recorded the same way twice. Not because of magic in the physical sense, but because the act of defining them introduces contradiction. The archive that rewrote itself. One of the most disturbing legends from later monastic history describes a sealed archive room that contained a catalogue of forbidden medieval artifacts. At first, it was normal. Then scribes began noticing inconsistencies. Entries would change order overnight. Descriptions would shift tone without ink difference. And most disturbingly, new entries would appear in handwriting identical to previous scribes, despite those scribes being confirmed dead. One senior archivist reportedly wrote, "I read yesterday's catalogue, and it does not match the one I wrote yesterday." After that, access to the archive was permanently revoked. When the chamber was later reopened centuries later, it contained only blank parchment, no ink, no damage, no records, as if everything had been removed without physical erasure. The artifact that exists only in contradiction. Among the most recurring motifs in cursed medieval legend is an unnamed object described differently in every source. Some call it a crown, others call it a book, others a mirror, others refuse to name it at all. Its properties also shift. In one account, it reveals truth. In another, it destroys truth. In another, it replaces truth entirely. What remains consistent is only one detail. Anyone who tries to define it precisely ends up contradicting themselves in writing. Later, historians referred to this phenomenon as semantic collapse, where meaning breaks under its own description. The monks who refused to translate further. In a remote monastery archive, a group of monks reportedly worked on translating a set of corrupted medieval texts referencing cursed object. At first, translation was possible. Then, inconsistencies began. Words would translate into different meanings depending on who read them. Entire sentences reversed intent. Eventually, the monks stopped working altogether. Their final collective note stated, "We cannot continue translating something that changes what language is." After this, the manuscript was sealed and never referenced again. The idea that replaced the artifacts. Over time, historians began to notice something more abstract than missing objects. The ideas of cursed artifacts persisted, even when physical evidence did not. This led to a final theory, that medieval cursed artifacts were never stable objects at all. They were narrative attractors, concepts that gather fear, interpretation, and contradiction until they form legendary density. In this view, the artifacts do not exist because they are real. They exist because too many stories converge on the same uncertainty. Final reflection of the entire chronicle. Across all 7 parts of this narrative, one pattern remains constant. Not the objects themselves, but the way humans respond to uncertainty. A broken sword becomes cursed. A strange mirror becomes prophetic. A missing record becomes forbidden knowledge. And over time, the boundary between observation and imagination disappears. What remains is a medieval world filled not just with relics, but with the fear of what cannot be fully understood or permanently recorded. That is where cursed artifacts truly come from. Not from metal, wood, or stone, but from the moment history stops being certain. When historians speak about the Middle Ages, they often describe wars, kingdoms, and religion. But beneath all of that, another layer is mentioned only in whispers. Structures that were never part of official maps. Hidden vaults, buried chambers, and sealed underground archives that supposedly contained objects too dangerous to catalogue properly. Some historians dismiss these as myth. Others argue they were simply lost in time. But medieval records themselves occasionally hint at something more disturbing. That certain things were deliberately placed underground, not to preserve them, but to separate them from history itself. The subterranean archive of silence. In scattered monastic references from Western Europe, there are mentions of what is called the silent archive. Unlike normal libraries, this was not a place of knowledge expansion. It was a place of containment. According to fragments, the silent archive contained objects that were never assigned proper names. Instead, they were labeled only by function or risk level. Object requiring nonverbal handling. Item of memory disturbance. Artifact with unstable narrative properties. The most disturbing detail is not what was stored there, but how it was accessed. Some accounts suggest that entering the archive required a vow not just of silence, but of non-description, meaning the visitor could not later describe what they saw, ever. The stone that recorded without ink. Among the most unusual medieval legends is an artifact known as the recording stone. Unlike manuscripts or scrolls, this object was said to preserve information without ink, engraving, or inscription. Witnesses claim that when placed near spoken words or written text, the stone absorbed meaning, not sound, not letters, but meaning itself. Later attempts to study it failed because every description of its behavior became inconsistent over time. Scholars who tried to document it reported that their notes changed upon rereading. One medieval cleric wrote, "I recorded it yesterday. Today my writing denies what I wrote." After that entry, the stone disappears from all official records. The door that opens only once in history. In several border regions of medieval Europe, there are references to a structure known simply as the once door. It is described as a sealed entrance built into no known building. No hinges, no frame, no visible mechanism. But according to legend, it can open exactly one time. Not per person, not per century, but once in its entire existence. What lies beyond it is never described consistently. Some accounts mention a chamber of objects. Others mention an empty space that feels complete. Others refuse to describe it at all. The most disturbing part is what follows. Every source agrees that after it opens once, it can never be proven to have existed again. Even its location disappears from maps and memory. The ledger that changes its past. A medieval financial archive, discovered in fragmented form, contains entries that appear to revise their own history. At first glance, it appears to be a normal administrative ledger, but closer examination reveals anomalies. Dates that do not align with known calendars. Transactions that reference events not recorded elsewhere. And entries that appear to correct earlier entries without explanation. One fragment reads, "Correction. The object was never transferred. It was always present." Another reads, "Correction of correction. Presence is not applicable." This suggests not only rewriting of records, but rewriting of context itself. The monks who forgot their own translation. In one monastery tradition, there is a disturbing account of a group of monks translating a sealed manuscript related to forbidden artifacts. At first, translation proceeded normally. Then inconsistencies began to appear between translators. Each monk reported a different meaning from the same passage. Eventually, they compared notes and discovered something impossible. They no longer agreed on the language they were translating. Some claimed it was Latin. Others insisted it was Greek. Others said it was neither. The final recorded sentence from that group states, "We are no longer certain what we are reading, only that it is responding." After that, translation stopped permanently. The principle of narrative instability. Modern interpretation of these legends suggests a pattern that repeats across multiple sources. Some medieval artifacts are not stable objects, but unstable narratives, meaning their description changes over time, their properties contradict each other, their records degrade into inconsistency, and attempts to define them produce new variations. In this view, the artifacts are not cursed in a supernatural sense. They are unstable in how humans are able to understand and record them. By the deeper layers of medieval legend, the stories no longer describe simple artifacts. They begin to describe places, institutions, and entire structures that behave like artifacts themselves. And among these, none is more disturbing than the idea of something that should have been permanent, yet no longer exists in any consistent historical record. A cathedral that was not destroyed, a cathedral that was erased. The cathedral with no fixed location. In fragmented European manuscripts, there is repeated mention of a grand cathedral, referred to only as the first stone church. At first, it appears in multiple regional records. Different cities claim it existed within their borders. Different chronicles describe its architecture in incompatible ways. Gothic in one account, Romanesque in another, and entirely unknown in a third. What unifies all accounts is not its design. It is its disappearance. Every historical reference agrees on one point. The cathedral was present at some stage of medieval religious life, and then later records stop acknowledging it entirely. No destruction record exists. No fire, no wood damage, no collapse, only silence. The map that refused to keep it. Cartographic fragments from medieval and early Renaissance periods show something unusual. In early versions of regional maps, a large structure is clearly marked at a central religious hub. In later versions of the same maps, the structure is still there, but unnamed. In even later copies, the same location appears slightly distorted, as if the surrounding geography has adjusted to remove emphasis from the structure. Eventually, in final surviving versions, the structure is gone entirely, but the roads leading to it remain, which suggests something deeply unsettling. The location was not removed from the map. The map was adjusted around its absence. The book that writes different histories for each reader. Among cursed medieval manuscripts, one stands apart for its instability of meaning across readers. Known in later references as the Chronicle of Divergent Truths, it was said to be a bound volume containing a complete history of a certain kingdom. But every person who read it reported a different version of events. For some, it described a peaceful reign. For others, the same reign was filled with war. For others still, the kingdom never existed at all. When scholars attempted comparison, they discovered something impossible. Each copy appeared identical physically, yet produced contradictory historical narratives depending on the reader. One monk wrote, "The book does not contain history. It contains interpretation that changes the past." After repeated attempts to stabilize its contents, the manuscript was sealed and eventually lost. The crown that exists in multiple timelines. Royal legends often describe cursed crowns as symbols of power and downfall. But one legend goes further. It describes a crown that does not belong to a single moment in history. Instead, it appears in multiple royal lineages across different eras, with no clear origin point. Some records describe it being worn during a coronation that contradicts known succession timelines. Others place it in wars that occurred centuries apart. What makes it more disturbing is not just contradiction, but repetition. Each time it appears, the outcome is similar: a brief rise in authority, followed by sudden instability, then disappearance. It is as if the crown does not move through time, but reappears whenever history allows it to destabilize. The monastery that forgot its own foundation. A lesser-known but highly disturbing account describes a monastery whose founding records do not align with its physical structure. Documents claim it was built in a specific year, but architectural analysis suggests it predates that period by centuries. Even more unusual, the monastery itself appears in different locations across historical maps from the same era. Some maps place it near mountains, others near rivers. Others show it in completely different regions entirely. Eventually, historians noted a pattern. The monastery appears wherever records attempt to place it, then disappears once those records stabilize. The theory of adaptive history. Modern interpretations of these anomalies suggest a final conceptual layer to cursed medieval artifacts and locations. Instead of assuming objects are cursed, some historians propose that certain elements of medieval record are adaptive to documentation itself, meaning the more they are recorded, the more they change. The more they are defined, the more contradictions emerge. The more stable the record becomes, the more the subject destabilizes. In this interpretation, history is not a fixed archive. It is a reactive system, and some elements within it refuse to remain fixed. By this final layer of medieval cursed artifact mythology, something changes in the nature of the stories themselves. They stop behaving like legends about objects. They start behaving like records about record keeping. History is no longer just describing cursed artifacts. It is struggling to contain them. And at the center of all remaining fragments lies one recurring idea: a final archive that does not preserve history, but preserves the act of observing history. The cathedral that appears only after it is forgotten. Among the most paradoxical legends of late medieval Europe is a structure that cannot be remembered directly. Known in fragmented references as the unremembered cathedral, it is said to function in reverse of normal historical logic. People do not find it. They forget it first. Only after forgetting does it appear again in indirect evidence, footnotes, marginal sketches, incomplete maps, or inconsistent testimonies from unrelated regions. Some travelers claimed to see it once, but were unable to describe it afterward. Others insisted they had dreams of a cathedral they had never seen before, realizing they had already passed through its presence unknowingly. One monastic note reads, "You do not arrive at it. You lose your certainty, and it becomes visible." The book that writes itself. When not read among all cursed manuscripts, the final evolution of the idea is not a book that changes when read, but a book that stabilizes only when ignored. The silent autograph codex is described as a volume that remains blank when observed directly. But when left unattended, new writing appears across its pages, not handwritten, not copied, but fully formed text that appears structured, coherent, and internally consistent. When monks attempted surveillance, the writing ceased entirely. When surveillance stopped, the text returned. One scholar wrote, "It is not written. It is waiting for attention to end." Attempts to catalogue its contents failed permanently, as every inspection erased the phenomenon being observed. The final vault that records the observer. Deep beneath the most secretive monastic archives lies the most unsettling concept in all cursed medieval legend. A vault that does not store objects. It stores observation itself. referred to only as the null chamber in fragmented documents, it is described as an empty space containing no relics, no manuscripts, and no artifacts. But it is not considered empty. Instead, it is said to record whoever enters it. Not physically, not visually, but existentially. Some accounts claim that individuals who entered the chamber later discovered inconsistencies in their own memories, events they could not confirm but could not deny. One entry states, "The chamber does not contain history. It contains the act of witnessing history. After repeated incidents, access was permanently sealed. No records confirm what lies inside. Only that entry was once possible. The collapse of stable meaning." At this stage of the mythology, cursed artifacts no longer function as objects with properties. They function as instabilities in interpretation. Every attempt to define them creates contradiction. Every attempt to stabilize them produces variation. And every attempt to erase them results in persistence through narrative fragments. This leads to a final realization within the lore. The problem was never the artifacts themselves. The problem was the assumption that meaning could remain fixed. The final theory: history as a reactive system. Across all 10 parts of this chronicle, a single conceptual pattern emerges. Medieval cursed artifacts behave less like physical objects and more like reactions within a system that responds to interpretation. In this view, recording changes the record. Naming changes the thing. Named observing alters what is observed, and forgetting sometimes reveals what was hidden. This is not magic in the traditional sense. It is instability in how reality is structured through human understanding. After the collapse of stable medieval records, historians believed the age of cursed artifacts had ended. They assumed silence meant disappearance. They assumed absence meant destruction. But medieval archives suggest something far more unsettling. Silence did not mean the objects were gone. It meant they were no longer allowed to be fully described. Across fragmented monastic records, there are repeated references to hidden archives that were never part of public history. These were not myths or rumors. They were structured record systems that existed parallel to official documentation. They were called duplicate archives, and they contained what official history refused to finalize. In these duplicate archives, monks recorded objects that could not be safely classified. Some were described as unstable relics, others as contradictory artifacts. Many entries were left deliberately incomplete, ending mid-sentence or mid-description. Every entry carried the same warning phrase: "Not for continuation." This phrase did not mean the record was temporary. It meant the record was dangerous if it continued beyond its original moment of writing, because continuation changed meaning, and meaning, in these systems, was not fixed. One of the most disturbing discoveries in later monastic accounts is the existence of a vault that rejects reopening. This vault was not protected by locks or physical barriers. It was protected by instability in access itself. Every attempt to reopen it produced conflicting instructions. Keys would no longer match. Maps would contradict themselves. Even the recorded location would shift between documents. One expedition reported reaching the exact site of the vault successfully. But when they attempted to confirm entry, they could not determine whether they had already been inside before arriving. Their final written statement reads, "We cannot determine if this is entry or return." After this, no further reliable attempts were recorded. Another fragment describes a manuscript that behaves differently after being sealed. At first, it appears to be a normal medieval text. It is catalogued, studied, and then stored for preservation. But upon reopening after sealing, new text appears inside the manuscript. This new text was not added by any scribe. It simply exists. Even more disturbing, the added text references events that occurred after the manuscript was last sealed. One monk recorded his observation in disbelief. It does not record history. It continues it when unobserved. Following this discovery, the manuscript was removed from all known catalogue systems. No final location is recorded. Scattered among these accounts is also mentions of a monastic order responsible for handling forbidden knowledge. They did not destroy cursed artifacts. They did not attempt to study them aggressively. Instead, they contained them in controlled uncertainty. Their guiding principle was simple. If something cannot be safely understood, it must be safely left undefined. This order is not clearly documented in later history. There is no confirmed record of its dissolution or survival. Yet references to its methods appear in later archives, suggesting influence without presence, as if the order itself became part of the system it tried to control. A recurring pattern emerges across all these accounts. Medieval records begin to avoid final statements. Descriptions end abruptly. Explanations are omitted. Conclusions are missing, not due to damage or loss, but due to deliberate avoidance of finality. Because final definitions were believed to freeze meaning, and in systems where meaning is unstable, freezing it creates contradiction. So records were left unfinished, not because they were incomplete, but because completion itself was considered unsafe. In the end, cursed medieval artifacts are no longer understood as physical objects. They are understood as unstable points within historical interpretation. Their danger is not in what they are. Their danger is in what happens when they are fully defined. And so history does something unusual. It refuses to conclude them. It leaves them open. By the time medieval cursed artifact records reach their later layers, the structure of history itself begins to look less like a timeline and more like a fragile system of overlapping interpretations. Events are no longer fixed. Objects are no longer stable. Even records begin to behave unpredictably, depending on how and when they are read. And within this unstable framework, one idea begins to appear repeatedly across scattered monastic sources. The idea that some records do not only describe history, they influence it. The living index of forbidden objects. Among the most unsettling discoveries mentioned in late medieval archival fragments is a catalogue that behaves unlike any normal register. It is referred to as the living index. Unlike standard inventories, this index does not remain static after being written. Instead, it appears to reorganize itself over time. Entries shift positions. Categories change. Some listed items disappear entirely from one version to the next. But the most disturbing feature is not alteration. It is addition. New entries appear without any recorded author. These entries do not describe physical objects in detail. Instead, they describe conditions, behaviors, and anomalies such as object that resists final classification, artifact that appears only after documentation item that cannot be consistently observed. Every attempt to verify these entries results in inconsistency between copies. One archivist wrote, "It is not a list of objects. It is a list of things that refuse to become objects." After this note, his name disappears from subsequent records. The chronicle that writes the reader. Instead of being read in a remote monastic archive, scholars describe a manuscript that behaves in reverse of all known textual logic. Known as the Mirror Chronicle, it does not simply change when read, it changes the reader. Individuals who spend time with the text report gradual shifts in memory alignment. Certain recollections become uncertain. Some events feel unfamiliar. Others feel newly significant without explanation. More disturbing are accounts from multiple readers who describe noticing sentences in the manuscript that appear to reference their own thoughts before they are consciously formed. One scholar documented his experience. "I stopped reading it because it began finishing my intentions before I had them." After repeated incidents, the manuscript was sealed. But even after sealing, references to its content appear in unrelated documents, as if its influence persists outside direct access. The vault that exists only while being described. Among the most paradoxical medieval records is the mention of a containment site that does not behave like a physical location. It is described as the conditional vault. Its existence depends entirely on documentation. When recorded, it appears to exist within administrative systems, maps, and inventories. But when attempts are made to physically locate it, results are inconsistent. Some expeditions report finding an empty site. Others find nothing at all. Others report finding structures that disappear upon inspection. A troubling pattern emerges. The more detailed the description, the less stable its physical confirmation becomes. One monk summarized it in a single line. "It exists only as long as we are unsure what it is." The disappearance of final knowledge. Across all these accounts, a consistent transformation occurs in medieval record-keeping. Earlier archives aimed for completion. Later archives avoid it. Definitions become partial. Conclusions are omitted. Descriptions end without resolution, not due to ignorance, but due to caution. Because in these narratives, final knowledge is not considered safe knowledge. Finality creates rigidity, and rigidity, in unstable systems, produces contradiction. So records remain open-ended, always. As the medieval cursed artifact narratives deepen further, the records begin to show an even more alarming shift. It is no longer just objects and archives behaving unpredictably. Now, even witnesses become unstable within the historical record. Names disappear from documents. Observers contradict their own earlier accounts. Entire testimonies collapse into uncertainty upon later review. At this stage, the question is no longer what these artifacts are. The question becomes whether anyone who encounters them can remain consistently recorded at all. The archive that deletes its own witnesses. Among the most feared concepts in late monastic record fragments is a restricted archive that does not only store forbidden knowledge, it also erases those who access it. Referred to as the null witness archive, it is described as a sealed repository containing unstable records of cursed medieval artifacts that were never meant to persist in normal documentation. But the most disturbing feature is not its content. It is its effect on observers. Multiple fragmented reports suggest that individuals who entered the archive later became partially absent from historical records. Their names appear in early documents, but are missing in later revisions. Their contributions exist without attribution. In some cases, their entire identity is replaced with vague terms such as unnamed scribe or unknown observer. One surviving note states, "The archive does not preserve knowledge. It preserves without the people who knew it." After this, all direct references to the archive cease. The manuscript that requires forgetting to read. In a remote tradition preserved in scattered references, there exists a manuscript that cannot be fully understood through continuous reading. It is known as the Amnesia Codex. Unlike ordinary texts, comprehension of this manuscript appears to require intermittent forgetting. Readers report that if they attempt to read it continuously, the meaning becomes unclear or contradictory. But if they stop reading for a period of time and return later, the text becomes coherent again, though never identical to its previous interpretation. This creates a disturbing cycle. To understand it, one must forget it, but each return produces a different version of understanding. One monk wrote, "The book does not change. The reader does." After prolonged study attempts, access to the manuscript was restricted due to reports of cognitive instability among scribes. The cathedral that rebuilds itself differently in every record. Among architectural legends of medieval Europe, one structure appears repeatedly under different forms. Sometimes it is described as a cathedral, sometimes as a basilica, sometimes as a fortified religious complex, but in every version, it shares one defining property. It does not retain a consistent historical form. When referenced in earlier records, its design differs from later descriptions. Even its location varies depending on the document source. More unusually, restoration records suggest that whenever the structure is rebuilt after destruction, it reappears with altered architecture and layout. One chronicler notes, "It is always rebuilt correctly, but never the same correctly." Eventually, historians stop attempting to reconcile its descriptions and instead treat each reference as a separate instance of the same phenomenon. The principle of observer-dependent history. Across all these fragmented accounts, a theoretical pattern begins to emerge in later interpretation. It suggests that medieval cursed artifacts and structures are not simply unstable objects. They are dependent on observation, meaning the act of recording influences what is recorded. The act of reading influences what is understood. The act of witnessing influences what remains consistent. In this framework, history is not a fixed sequence of events. It is a responsive system shaped by those who attempt to document it. And in such a system, complete certainty becomes impossible. As the cursed medieval archive narrative continues to evolve, a new pattern emerges in the most fragmented and unstable records. It is no longer just objects, manuscripts, or observers that behave unpredictably. Now, entire systems of knowledge begin to depend on absence itself. The more something is studied, the less stable it becomes. And the more carefully it is recorded, the more it resists final definition. At this stage, medieval cursed artifacts are no longer treated as isolated anomalies. They become part of a larger phenomenon, knowledge that requires instability to exist. The library that only exists while being ignored. Among the most paradoxical legends in late monastic tradition is a structure known as the unobserved library. It is described not as a building in a fixed location, but as a repository that only maintains existence when it is not actively being referenced. Whenever scholars attempt to locate it directly, maps become inconsistent. Directions contradict each other. Even eyewitness accounts fail to align. But when attention shifts away from it, references reappear in unrelated documents, as if the library continues to function in the background of history. One archivist wrote, "The moment we look for it, it becomes uncertain. The moment we stop, it becomes documented again." This leads to an impossible conclusion. Its existence depends on not being observed continuously. The relic that changes meaning between languages. In multilingual monastic regions, scholars describe a relic that cannot retain consistent meaning across translation. Referred to in fragments as the polysemantic relic, it appears in records under different interpretations, depending on language. In Latin texts, it is described as a blessing object. In Greek interpretations, it becomes a warning artifact. In later vernacular accounts, it is treated as an undefined presence. Attempts to unify these descriptions result in contradiction, not clarification. Even more unusual is the claim that translators working independently arrive at entirely different conclusions about its function, despite analyzing identical source material. One scribe recorded, "It does not change form. It changes meaning depending on who defines it." After repeated inconsistencies, translation efforts were permanently halted. The chronicle that forgets its own ending. Among medieval manuscripts, one recurring anomaly is a text that lacks a stable conclusion. Known in fragmented references as the self-resetting chronicle, it appears to document a sequence of historical events normally, until the final section. At that point, the narrative changes or disappears entirely. In some copies, the ending is missing. In others, it contradicts earlier content. In some, it loops back to earlier chapters without explanation. What makes this especially unsettling is that scribes who attempt to rewrite or preserve the ending report that their revisions are later overwritten in new copies. One monk wrote, "Every time we define its ending, it writes a different one." Eventually, the manuscript is treated not as a single history, but as an ongoing sequence of unstable conclusions. The principle of historical feedback loops across these fragmented accounts. A deeper theoretical structure begins to emerge. It suggests that medieval knowledge systems are not linear. Instead, they function as feedback loops. Observation alters documentation. Documentation alters interpretation. Interpretation alters future observation. In such a system, stability is impossible because every attempt to fix meaning feeds back into changing it. This leads to a paradoxical condition. The more complete a record becomes, the less reliable it is. As the medieval cursed artifact chronicle reaches its deeper layers, one final transformation becomes clear. The instability is no longer limited to objects, texts, or observers. Now, even time itself begins to appear inconsistent within the records. Events are no longer simply recorded differently. They appear to be recorded from different outcomes. And within this shift, the idea of a single, unified medieval history begins to fracture completely. The manuscript that writes only in future knowledge. Among the most paradoxical medieval texts described in later monastic fragments is a manuscript that appears to contain information that has not yet occurred at the time of reading. Referred to in scattered references as the anticipatory codex, it is said to produce entries that describe events before they are documented elsewhere. At first, scribes believed this to be coincidence or misinterpretation, but repeated analysis showed a disturbing pattern. The manuscript consistently contained details of events that were later confirmed in separate records, sometimes years after the text had already been copied. One monk recorded, "It does not predict the future. It writes from it." After repeated incidents of contradiction between the manuscript and existing archives, it was sealed and removed from standard classification systems. Its current status remains unknown. The vault that refuses completion. In several fragmented medieval accounts, there is mention of a containment structure that cannot be considered finished. It is referred to only as the incomplete vault. Unlike normal sealed chambers, this vault appears to resist closure in a structural sense. Whenever construction is recorded as complete, later documents describe additional modifications that were never officially authorized. Doors that were sealed appear reopened in new records. Chambers that were documented as empty are later listed as containing restricted material. One chronicler noted, "We finish it. It continues. Attempts to finalize its structure ultimately fail, as each record of completion generates further revision. The vault becomes an ongoing process rather than a finished structure." The artifact that splits into multiple versions, when described among the most unusual anomalies in cursed medieval artifact records, is an object that does not maintain a single identity when documented. Known in fragmented accounts as the divergent relic, it appears to divide conceptually into multiple versions depending on how it is described. Different scribes produce different classifications. Some describe it as a weapon, others as a ritual object, others as a sealed container. When these descriptions are compared, they do not converge into a unified understanding. Instead, they remain separate and equally persistent interpretations. One archivist wrote, "It is not one thing with many descriptions. It is many things created by description." This leads to an unresolved archival condition where the artifact exists simultaneously in multiple recorded forms without contradiction resolution. The collapse of single reality history. Across all these accounts, a final structural breakdown becomes apparent in medieval record interpretation. The assumption of a single, consistent historical reality begins to fail. Instead, records suggest multiple interpretations of the same event, multiple versions of the same object, multiple outcomes preserved simultaneously in documentation. This creates what later scholars describe as a fractured historical system. In this system, history is no longer a singular narrative. It becomes a branching structure of possible records, each sustained by the act of documentation itself. One final monastic note summarizes it. History does not agree with itself, because it is no longer one thing. As the medieval cursed artifact chronicle moves beyond the collapse of single reality history, the records begin to describe something even more unstable than multiple versions of events. They begin to describe systems where all versions exist at once, yet none can be confirmed as final. In this stage, history is no longer fractured, it is layered, and each layer behaves as if it is the only one that is true. The final archive that contains all versions of history. Among the most disturbing concepts in late monastic record tradition is a structure referred to as the total archive. It is described as a final repository designed to collect every known version of medieval history, including conflicting accounts, contradictory chronicles, and erased entries. At first, scholars believed this archive would resolve inconsistencies by unifying all records into a single corrected version. But reports suggest the opposite occurred. Instead of convergence, the archive expanded into parallel layers of documentation, each containing a different version of the same events. Each layer insists on its own accuracy, and no mechanism exists to determine which is correct. One archivist wrote, "It does not unify history, it multiplies it." After this discovery, access to the archive becomes restricted, and references to it become inconsistent across later documents. The relic that exists only in contradiction. Among cursed medieval artifact accounts, one object stands out for its inability to stabilize under description. Known in fragmented sources as the paradox relic, it does not maintain a fixed identity. Whenever it is defined in one way, an alternative definition appears in another record with equal authority. Some describe it as a crown, others as a book, others as a sealed vessel. Each version is supported by different monastic sources, yet none can invalidate the others. Attempts to reconcile these descriptions fail, as each interpretation generates new conflicting records. One scholar summarized it. It exists only where definitions disagree. This creates a condition where contradiction is not a flaw in the record, but the only evidence of the object's presence. The monastery that splits into parallel records. In several medieval references, there is mention of a monastic institution that appears differently depending on the archive consulted. In some records, it is a center of learning. In others, it is a containment facility. In others still, it does not exist at all. Even more unusual is the fact that its internal records contradict each other across versions of the same manuscript. Some catalogues list artifacts that others do not acknowledge. Some inventories describe rooms that are absent in parallel descriptions. This leads to the theory that the monastery does not exist in a single fixed state. Instead, it exists as multiple overlapping recorded versions that never fully align. One chronicler noted, "We are not recording one monastery. We are recording all possible monasteries at once." The end of fixed medieval reality. At this stage of interpretation, medieval cursed artifact records undergo a final conceptual transformation. The assumption of a fixed reality becomes unsustainable. Instead, historical documentation suggests multiple valid versions of the same events, multiple simultaneous interpretations of the same objects, and no definitive method to confirm which version is real. In this framework, reality is no longer a single timeline. It becomes a collection of recorded possibilities. One final note from an anonymous archivist reads, "We stopped trying to correct history. We realized history was not broken. It was never singular." At this stage of the medieval cursed artifact chronicle, the idea of multiple histories no longer feels like contradiction. It becomes structure. Records do not fight each other anymore. They coexist. But a new and more unsettling pattern begins to appear in later fragmented archives. Not all observers access the same version of history, and not all records are visible to everyone. The archive that chooses which history you see. Among the most disturbing late monastic references is a structure called the selective archive. Unlike the total archive described earlier, this system does not contain all versions of history equally. Instead, it presents different historical records depending on the observer. Different monks consulting the same archive report entirely different contents. Some describe peaceful chronologies. Others describe wars and collapses. Others report missing sections where entire centuries appear to be absent. One archivist noted, "The archive does not show history. It selects it." This leads to a destabilizing conclusion. History is not only multiple, it is filtered, and the filter is not consistent. The artifact that changes depending on the reader's timeline. In scattered medieval sources, there is mention of a relic that does not maintain a fixed form across time or observation. Referred to as the temporal reflective object, it appears differently depending on when and by whom it is examined. A monk in one century describes it as a sealed stone container. A later account describes it as a written codex. Another describes it as an empty space that cannot be entered, but can be felt. Even more disturbing is the claim that individuals who study it begin to experience inconsistencies in their own personal timeline, remembering events in a different order than others around them. One record states, "It does not change with time. It changes what time is to the reader." Attempts to standardize its description result in further divergence between accounts. The vault that exists in every version, but not all at once. Among the most paradoxical medieval containment structures is a vault that appears across multiple historical versions, but cannot be confirmed as existing in all of them simultaneously. Known in fragmented records as the distributed vault, it is described as a containment system whose location shifts depending on the version of history being referenced. In one set of records, it is beneath a monastery. In another, beneath a cathedral. In another, it is located within a royal fortress. Yet in each version, it is described as the same vault. Scholars attempting to unify these accounts discovered a consistent pattern. The vault exists wherever the current version of history allows it to exist. One monk wrote, "It is not moved, it is reassigned." This creates a condition where containment is not physical, but historical. The emergence of observer-locked reality systems. Across all these accounts, a final structural interpretation emerges in late monastic theory. It suggests that medieval cursed artifact systems are not only unstable in themselves, but locked to the observer. Meaning, each observer receives a different stable version of reality. Each archive presents a filtered structure of events, and each record adapts based on who is accessing it. In this framework, reality is not universal. It is personalized through observation. One final fragment summarizes it. We are not sharing one history. We are each holding a different stable version of something that cannot be unified. At this final stage of the cursed medieval artifact chronicle, even the idea of shared reality begins to fracture further. It is no longer only that different observers see different histories. It is that agreement itself becomes unstable. When multiple accounts attempt to unify, the unification fails. Not because the records are incomplete, but because consensus itself cannot hold a fixed form. The final monastery that splits between observers. Among the most paradoxical medieval accounts is a monastery that does not maintain a single consistent existence across observers. Known in fragmented sources as the divergent monastery, it appears stable in isolated records, yet changes dramatically when cross-referenced. One group of monks describes it as a quiet center of theological study. Another describes it as a containment site for unstable relics. A third record claims it is abandoned and structurally collapsed. What makes this phenomenon unique is not the contradiction itself, but the simultaneity of it. Each account is internally consistent, yet mutually incompatible. One archivist wrote, "It is not one monastery with different descriptions. It is different monasteries occupying the same name. The artifact that exists only when not being agreed upon." Among cursed medieval relic descriptions, one object stands out for its resistance to consensus. Referred to as the consensus null artifact, it does not stabilize when described collectively. Individual accounts of the object are clear and detailed when written independently. But when those accounts are compared or unified, inconsistencies multiply instead of resolving. More disturbingly, some records suggest that the object becomes less defined the more agreement is attempted about it. One monk noted, "It only remains stable while we disagree." This creates a paradox where shared understanding actively destabilizes the subject of discussion. The chronicle that rewrites consensus. In later monastic archives, scholars describe a manuscript that does not merely record events. It records agreement about events. Known as the Concordance Chronicle, it initially appears to document historical consensus between different regions. But over time, discrepancies emerge not in events themselves, but in how agreement is described. Some entries show unanimous consensus on a historical fact. Later versions of the same entry show partial disagreement. Still later versions show complete fragmentation of that same consensus. One archivist wrote, "It does not record history. It records how unstable agreement is about history." Eventually, the chronicle becomes impossible to finalize, as every attempt to stabilize agreement generates new divergence. The collapse of shared historical agreement. Across all these accounts, a final transformation becomes visible in the medieval cursed artifact narrative. The collapse is no longer about objects, records, or even observers. It is about consensus itself. The assumption that multiple people can agree on a single stable version of events begins to fail. Instead, each observer stabilizes their own version. Each record system reinforces its own interpretation, and attempts to unify them produce further divergence. In this system, shared history no longer functions as a single structure. It becomes a collection of overlapping but incompatible agreements. One final fragment states, "We no longer disagree about history. We disagree about what agreement even means." At this stage of the cursed medieval artifact chronicle, even disagreement has begun to stabilize into patterns. But those patterns do not resolve into truth. Instead, they reveal something more unsettling, that truth itself behaves differently depending on whether it is challenged. And in the final layers of monastic interpretation, a new category of records begins to appear. Records that only remain stable under specific conditions of belief and doubt. The final record that only exists when unchallenged. Among the most paradoxical late medieval documents is a manuscript referred to as the passive codex. Unlike earlier unstable texts, this one does not change when read. It changes when questioned. When accepted without scrutiny, its contents remain coherent, structured, but internally consistent. But the moment a reader attempts to verify, compare, or challenge its statements, inconsistencies begin to emerge. Sections shift. Details no longer align. Entire passages become contradictory across copies. One monk recorded, "It is only stable when we do not resist it." This leads to a disturbing implication. The act of doubt itself destabilizes the record, the artifact that dissolves under agreement. In scattered monastic references, there is mention of an object that behaves in the opposite manner of most known cursed relics. Referred to as the anti-consensus relic, it appears clearly in individual accounts, but becomes increasingly undefined when multiple observers agree on its nature. When described separately, witnesses report consistent characteristics, but when those descriptions are combined, the object's identity begins to fragment across interpretations. Eventually, unified descriptions produce no stable form at all. One archivist wrote, "It does not resist belief. It resists agreement." This creates a condition where collective certainty removes the object from definable existence. The monastery, where every version is true locally. Among the most complex medieval anomalies is a monastery that appears to validate every contradictory account internally. Known in fragmented sources as the local truth monastery, it is described as a structure where all versions of events are correct within their own observational context. To one observer, the monastery is peaceful and orderly. To another, it is fragmented and abandoned. To another, it is under constant reconstruction. Each version is internally consistent, and none overrides the others. One chronicler noted, "Every truth is real, but only where it is seen." This creates a condition where truth is no longer universal, but spatially or cognitively localized. The fragmentation of truth itself. Across these final records, a broader collapse becomes evident in medieval epistemology. Truth is no longer treated as a fixed point of reference. Instead, it becomes dependent on observation, sensitive to agreement, resistant to contradiction in different ways, and unstable under collective interpretation. In this framework, truth does not disappear. It disperses. One final monastic fragment summarizes it. We did not lose the truth. We lost the place where truth stays the same. At the end of all fragmented medieval records, after all contradictions, overlapping histories, unstable manuscripts, and observer-dependent truths, the final pattern becomes clear. Not because it resolves, but because it stops changing further. The system does not collapse. It settles into permanent uncertainty. And within that uncertainty, the last surviving monastic interpretations attempt to describe something that no longer behaves like history at all. It behaves like a field of interpretation that never stabilizes. The archive that writes different truths for each observer. Among the final recorded anomalies is a structure referred to as the absolute archive. It is not described as a library or vault, but as a system that generates a different complete version of history for each individual who accesses it. Every observer receives a fully coherent historical record. Each version is internally consistent, complete, and believable. But no two versions match. Attempts to compare them fail, not because of missing data, but because the structure of agreement itself dissolves upon comparison. One final archivist wrote, "It does not hide truth. It produces enough truth for each mind to survive it." After this entry, the archivist's name disappears from all later copies of the record. The relic that only exists in partial understanding. In the last layers of medieval artifact tradition, there is mention of an object that cannot be fully perceived. Referred to only as the incomplete presence, it is said to appear clearly only when not fully understood. If a viewer understands too little, it is indistinct. If a viewer understands too much, it breaks into contradictions. Only in partial comprehension does it appear stable. One monk summarized it. It exists in the space between knowing and not knowing. This creates a condition where clarity destroys the object and confusion sustains it. Across all remaining records, a final epistemic shift is documented. Verification itself becomes unreliable. Cross-referencing fails. Consensus fragments. Even repeated observation produces inconsistent outcomes, depending on method, timing, or observer context. Medieval scholars attempting final classification conclude that reality cannot be fully stabilized through documentation alone. One concluding fragment reads, "We tried to fix history. History refused to become fixed." This marks the final transition away from verifiable historical certainty. In its final conceptual form, the cursed medieval artifact system is no longer about objects, manuscripts, or monasteries. It becomes a structure defined by interaction. Observation creates variation. Agreement creates fragmentation, Definition creates instability, and understanding produces partial collapse. Nothing remains fully independent of interpretation. Everything exists through relation, and no single account can contain the whole. In the end, the cursed medieval ages do not conclude with destruction or revelation. They conclude with irreducible multiplicity. No final artifact is recovered. No final truth is confirmed. No final version of history is established. Instead, what remains is a system of overlapping interpretations, each stable on its own, each incompatible in totality. And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all: the Middle Ages did not hide cursed artifacts. It produced a way of understanding the world where anything could become one. And once that way of thinking exists, it never fully disappears.